Hi, I'm Brett. We're here with Chris Lemaster, resident devil's advocate, and Caleb, resident switching spirit. Since you won't be able to see him at all if he chimes in. Say hi, Caleb.
I'm here.
We're going to talk today about, we're going to conduct a not so cogent discussion on relationships.
Yeah, so here on Not So Cogent Thoughts, we take a topic and not so concisely talk about it.
Yes, that's the point of the name. So, we're going to focus on toxic relationships and boundaries.
Okay.
Are you doing this? Or am
Sure,
I
I did it last time. I'll do it again.
Okay.
Okay, so last video we discussed the importance of relationships, like why we should have them, for evolutional reasons, psychological reasons, so forth. But I think near the end I asked, there are some relationships we shouldn't have, though, right? We're not called to be in a relationship with everyone.
Yeah.
So what are some situations in which we should not have a relationship? Or is there a way to define a good relationship boundary?
Yeah, I think there is, and it's a pretty big topic. So the list of criteria, I guess, for having a healthy relationship is pretty long list. So, but when we talk about relationships that should be avoided, we refer to those, at least in our culture, as toxic relationships. And we try to define some boundaries for the relationships, either to keep them from becoming toxic or to limit them if they are toxic, even in them if we need to. So there are a lot of different relationships that we could use as examples for toxic relationships.
Yeah, so I mean, everything is a relationship, and there's good
Right.
and bad relationships. So what's an example of a toxic one then?
Well, a really obvious example would be someone who is in the throes of addiction, and they are being very self-destructive and then consequently destructive in the lives of the people around them. So there are really good reasons in that situation to draw some healthy boundaries with them.
Okay, so what if they're... I went through this whole thing. So I have a close family member, who had a very toxic relationship with family between... So it was my sister, so my mom and myself, where she was very self-destructive and in turn destructive to the family. And I went through the battle of, I didn't want to be an enabler, and that's not where I tend to fault in. But I went extreme the other way, where I just cut everything off, and I had nothing to do with her, not in a mean way. I just didn't have any contact. I just cut myself off. But that wouldn't be healthy either, especially if it's a relationship that is family. I can't avoid for the most part. So what are ways to deal with that? How does someone recognize that or create healthy boundaries?
It's different for everybody. So you don't have a problem with enabling people. What you have a problem with is allowing any kind of relationship in your life, even in this case, your sister, if her behavior is just overtly destructive.
Yeah, and where that tends to be bad is the judgmental part. And luckily I had enough people around me to help me not be judgmental of her. I wasn't definitely in the beginning. But even after I got past the judging her for her actions, it turned to the, okay, well, I don't judge her. She can do what she's doing, and I still love her, and she's still a human being. She still has value. But to me, no. I'm not going to have any relationship with her. So, yeah, there is that side. How do you form good boundaries on that side? Let's start there.
How do you keep from... This is where boundaries actually can help you to not just completely cut someone off. That's what you're getting at. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
and I guess I would say it was also a toxic relationship on my part then, because cutting off someone isn't a good relationship, and all I'm doing is hurting a relationship at that point, especially with someone that I should have a relationship with, at least to an extent.
And maybe that's a good litmus test. Am I contributing to the destruction of the relationship?
Mm-hmm.
If I am, in this case, it's obvious because you're cutting it off. You're
Yeah.
ending the relationship altogether.
Yeah.
If I'm contributing to that, and it's a relationship that I don't really have much choice but to be in some way,
Yeah.
like in the case of family,
Yeah.
then yeah, there's a cutoff point there where you say, I can't cut this person out of my life forever.
No,
I can't be black and white about this or absolute about this.
I don't want to be too. I think that can be taken too easily, used wrongly. I think that could be too easily used poorly, is what I'm saying. Because just because she's family doesn't mean it's a relationship I have to be in. And
That's true.
I 100% understand that. Being adopted and having family here and there and leave and go. Family is what you make it. You don't have to be in a relationship with them because they're your family.
Good point.
But at that time, I had to because we were in the same house.
Right.
And you can't not help but have some sort of relationship there.
Right.
And then even when I moved out, she was still local. She was still involved in my life frequently, to some extent. But like now, she lives in another state, and I don't hear from her for 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, would it be healthy to cut off that type of relationship? Well, yeah, but there's really not a relationship there as it is.
Yeah.
So,
but the other side of this is when someone insists on staying in that very destructive, toxic relationship, maybe because they feel like they have to be in it. So a good example would be a parent with a child who's in a situation like your sister, or even a sibling, where that they feel like they have to keep reaching out. They have to keep doing whatever they think is possible to help this person get out of their life,
yeah.
and so on. So this is where some boundaries are needed for that type of person, because they will not necessarily enable the person, but they'll spend so much time and emotional energy on that person that it ends up detrimental to their own life in general. So they're just not available to other people who need them and care, and that they care for, but that they just don't have time or emotional energy to invest in them.
Yeah.
So other kids in the family and so on. And this is what's problematic. I mean, this stuff is just so complicated. Relationships are messy, you know?
Yeah. And there's really no hard rule. It's always going to be a case by case.
Definitely.
But there are some stereotypes that you can learn from, in that you have to have boundaries with a person who is destructive, self or to others.
Yeah.
You have to have boundaries. And usually if you don't have boundaries, it's easy to then lead into you being codependent. And that relationship becoming a toxic codependent relationship. Or you just being used and being destroyed by the destructive habits and behaviors of the other person.
And that would be an example. There would be a parent or a sibling. My dad has, the number of addicts and on my dad's side of the family. I mean, it's almost like the entire family.
Yeah.
And he was the one kid that kind of rose above all that and led a normal life, what we call normal. And he still struggles with this, where he has to set some stern boundaries with siblings that still want to take advantage of, he has more money, as an example, than anybody else in the family. So, but he's been able to do that, but it's taken him, he's 73 now.
Yeah,
and
it's
a really tough thing to learn.
Yeah. So the other end of that is another part of a toxic relationship is the codependent person or pair of people.
Yeah.
Because really, to have a codependent relationship, you have to have two.
Right. So you touched on the one thing, which is enabling, and that's kind of a principal symptom of codependency. But the other side to codependency is the need for someone else's approval. So when it's a codependent relationship, you may be the person that really needs to be accepted. You need to feel like you're accepted by this person. And so that can often lead to you enabling them. And again, this is very common with parents and addicted kids who have addictions, where they just enable them because they never want the kid to feel like they don't love them. Ironically, the action of enabling their addiction, and that can be in many different forms, ends up being action that is not really loving them.
Yeah, and so a lot of enabling leads to neglecting your own and others' needs. Mm-hmm. So, because helping someone isn't a bad thing.
No, of course
not. But
not.
when I'm helping you despite your own shit, whatever it might be, but also at the expense to myself or the expense to another loved one, at the expense of another loved one who needed it, then that becomes toxic. That becomes bad.
Yeah.
It becomes, I'm using bad, but it becomes a non-beneficial relationship.
Yeah. And this is why, when you look at the different wisdom traditions in the world, the founders of those movements, like Jesus, the Buddha, Lao Tzu, name it. You can name any of them, and they'll always want to draw students back to the sense of balance and working toward a middle way or a narrow path. A lot of people take what Jesus said about the narrow way, enter through the narrow gate and keep the narrow road, as avoiding hell. But that's not what he meant. He's talking about these very things. Like there's a balanced way to live your life, and this is why the Buddha says, follow the middle way, find out what that is, meditate on that, and keep it. Otherwise, you find yourself being depleted emotionally and so on, and not available. And
none of them claim that it's an easy thing to do.
No, they all will. That's why Jesus describes it, at least in part, by saying, "Take up your cross and follow me." So
or the whole narrow path thing.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to do, but it's worthwhile. It's worth working on.
Now, these are really like in your face, obvious toxic relationships that most people can point out in other people, even if they're blind to themselves.
Yes.
But where it's harder to see and people are more blind to themselves are examples like, when someone's in a marriage and it just isn't, let's take out the codependency or destructive habits part of toxic. They just aren't good for each other in the sense of their ambitions don't line up. Their parenting styles aren't going to be work.
Aren't going to be good for the child even. Yeah.
And they're just out views on life. And they got married for whatever reason, or they got together for whatever reason. But they just stick together because you shouldn't get a divorce, or I'm told I shouldn't get a divorce. My parents said that the only reason to get a divorce if X, Y, and Z happen, and those haven't happened, so I have to stick with it.
Right. Yeah, this is people tend to do this, and they gravitate towards what's known as moralism, where that they set up these boundaries for themselves that create a sense of certainty about the world. So the only reason to get divorced, so this happens in Christian circles all the time, the only legitimate reason for divorce, many Christians will say, is due to marital unfaithfulness, where someone's had an extramarital affair. Even that is ignorant. It shows the ignorance that most people possess concerning what Jesus said there. Because marital unfaithfulness is taken from a word that can mean so many different things that erode trust. So it's really about trust. So there's, to say that the only legitimate reason for a Christian to get divorced is due to an extramarital affair where they're physically intimate with someone, is nonsense. If trust is eroded to a certain point and there's no desire and therefore no effort, at least on the part of one person in the relationship, to move forward and try to rebuild through forgiveness and so on, then you can't control the other person. So you've got to...
That's more directly to what Jesus was speaking about.
Yeah.
Okay.
Things that erode trust. And the reason that the sexual reference is there is because, and it is a word that means, marital unfaithfulness in many different ways, but it is the word also that we derive our word for pornography from. It's porneia. And it is a word that, but the reason that he uses this is because of how vulnerable we are in the marital relationship, sexually especially. So there's it's an example of extreme vulnerability.
An easy way to break trust.
Yes.
Or break that.
Right.
An irreparable feeling of some kind.
Right.
Is more likely to happen.
Ultimate betrayal and so on. Yeah. So yeah, that's definitely a problem. And if people can get to the place where they can see their imbalance concerning their moral stands on things, and let go of their need for certainty, or their pseudo certainty really about life, and embrace the fact that life is messy, especially when it comes to relationships, I think that's a good, healthy start. The other thing that we need to do is also pay attention to ourselves, really get to know who I am and what I contribute to the problems in the relationship. And people are this is a very difficult thing to do. And most people don't want to do it. Psychologists call it different things. Carl Jung called it shadow work.
Yeah.
It's a difficult thing to do because the shadow side of yourself, or if you want to use biblical terms, it would be the sin nature side or the fleshy side, whatever, is that side that's filled with a sense of shame and worthlessness. And well, that's what shame is. And doesn't want to come out and be seen even by the conscious self. So it's a difficult process.
My friend's uncle, who is in a marriage, or was, and he and his wife, they just didn't have the same goals for life. Like what she wanted in a partner, he could never be. I mean, he probably could, but it wasn't in him. That wasn't what he wanted. That wasn't who he naturally was, or even the best him would be. And the same one for her. She couldn't support him the way he wanted, in his needs and his wants and how he lived his life and the things he wanted to do with it. But they stuck together because it's what you do. And what we're getting is that's another form of a toxic relationship.
Yeah.
Even if they're doing a good thing by staying married, and so they're having a good relationship, it's not really a good relationship.
And how are we even defining marriage? I think that's the other thing that the moralist gets caught up with. Like, what is that? Is it okay, we made a legal agreement and there's a piece of paper that says so? Or is this a really committed relationship? And why did I jump into this? And I know the relationship that you're talking about. And it's interesting because in the one case, the one spouse was, and for all intents and purposes, still is a moralist.
Yeah.
With these clear sets of rules and guidelines for life that give them a sense of certainty about the messy world. The other person is an enabler, a codependent, enabler, people pleaser, and so it was a very toxic situation for sure.
And I think that's a more subtle version of these toxic relationships, and it doesn't get addressed as much as the more obvious codependent and destructive behaviors.
Yeah.
I mean, and then in discussing this, my thoughts go back to, what about relationships in high school and friendships you have? So I was blessed with a great group of friends growing up.
Yeah.
I'm not very social or extroverted. And so I always had a small friend group, and the few people that were my friends, their wants and things lined up well with mine. And I think what is, again, a very narrow road that you have to follow is the person who, let's just say that they value like education. So they worked hard in school. They studied. They spent hours after school doing their homework and studying, made sure like ritualistically that it got done, because it's what they valued. It's what they wanted in their life. But they became friends with this person who wasn't, who loved sports or loved going out or hanging out with friends or just going to the movies, things that aren't bad in themselves.
No.
but they just didn't line up together. And so the person who who loves education and values education gives that up. It's like, well, I like it, but they don't. I'm going to go to the movies with them, and then they give up the things they value. At what point does that become toxic? Because at some point, there's always compromise within a relationship.
Balance, yeah.
But how easy is that to lose balance in? Because I see that as a fear of, once they do that, once they give up their value or they change their value for education, I think that's where the problem is if they start devaluing the things they valued because of the other person. So the person who valued education, who's then like, you know what, maybe my value is too high, I want to lower it because they don't see it. And I'm going to lower it again. If they're lowering it without good reason and they go past that boundary, that balance, then that just creates the habits for the future for everything else. They're always going to, I think it leads to codependency, but
it does.
It leads to, my values don't matter as much as yours. So I'm always going to follow what you want.
Right.
And I think that's another part of codependency that isn't, I think
it's more subtle. It's harder to see it. Yeah.
And I think that leads to what was the part under codependency that you had? Pleasing others. It may not necessarily be pleasing others. It's degrading yourself. That person may not seek out to please that person. They have a wrong self-image in that sense.
Yeah.
So what are things you can do to help with that, even though if it's so subtle that people don't usually recognize it?
Yeah. I mean, I know this can sound like a pat answer, but meditation is so important. It really is. And by that, it's a focused effort to know yourself. That's one form of meditation. Why do I feel like I need to sacrifice my study time to be able to go on this, to go to the movies this time, as an example? Why do I feel like that? I feel like that's a foolish decision, and I was just with them, a couple of days ago, and we did something else. So why is it so hard for me to just lay down that boundary and say, hey guys, I can't, I got to study?
Yeah.
Well, that probably is related, if they're willing to look at themselves enough, it's related to an insecurity. Like, maybe I'm not worthy of a relationship, so I better work really hard to stay in this one.
Or just the things I value really don't matter as much as what they value.
Yeah. Which is tantamount to saying I don't matter.
Yeah.
Right? Because your values are very intimately connected to you.
Yeah.
So.
And I laughed a little bit, but I think the meditation thing is seriously a good answer. And it's, if I were saying it, I would have said introspection, but we would say they're inextricably tied. They're the same thing. Yeah. And so as a parent, I'm not a parent. How do you do that for your children? It's hard. You can't, you have young kids. How do you set up meditation for Joseph or Ben?
I actually tried to do formal meditation with Joseph. And, at first he was just perfectly willing to do it and was even excited to do it. And I thought, this is going to be great. Yeah, he's really going to dive into this with me. But then, he's a little kid. I think he was like maybe 6 at the time. And, and soon he lost interest in it. So that's a good question. But I think if you're not trying to set up a formal, and this is the hang up that people have with meditation, and maybe it's the wrong word to use even when you're talking about these things. But really what we're talking about is taking time to be contemplative about me, not avoiding me and my issues, but actually intentionally thinking about my issues, or just not even just issues, but this is good for everything. But because we're talking about relationships, what am I really afraid of here? That I'm willing to sacrifice my values, my study time, for the sake of going to this movie.
Yeah.
And so for parents with young kids, it's not about setting up a formal time for meditation like I tried to do, but making sure that they are in an environment where they can really express how they're feeling and be okay with their feelings and not shamed for their feelings, so that they are more and more naturally contemplative about what's going on inside of them.
Yeah. What about...
Which still isn't easy. But.
No, I guess that's kind of why I asked, just thinking, how do you Because in the best case scenario, you raise a kid who you never have to struggle with those things. And how do you do that? Well, you have to be taught that at some point. It doesn't come naturally, usually, to most people.
Yeah.
So that's where my questions stem from. How do you start that at a young age? When do you start that? And so I think creating an atmosphere where they can talk about their feelings without feeling shame definitely leads to that, because the vocalizing and putting into words their thoughts is half of it. I mean, doing formal meditation, that's half of it. You have to tell yourself these things.
Yeah.
So
you're dialoguing with yourself.
And I mean, how often do you ask your kid, what are you mad about?
Right.
What's wrong?
Yeah.
And once they can get that, that's half the problem for them. They don't understand why they're upset, or they can't put it into words into a way that they can actually recognize it.
Yeah. Joseph really worries me that way, because he has a language disability, not a speech disability. There's a difference, but well, I'm not going to get into that. But the language disability makes it very difficult for him to communicate what it is that he's feeling, even to communicate that to himself. He's just like, he doesn't know. Mm-hmm. So it's got to be very frustrating for him, and it definitely is for us as parents, creating that safe place. I've tried to do that by, and maybe this would work even better for other kids with these issues, but one of the things that has been effective with Joseph is creating a role-playing environment that we have played since he was, 5.5, 6 years old.
Yeah.
Where that he has these stuffed animal friends that are like pretend friends, and we play out scenarios whenever we're in the car together, Yeah. And he'll actually be the one that initiates that. So that's been helpful in a lot of ways.
I mean, role playing, like imaginative role playing, has proven to be very helpful.
Yeah.
With a lot of dealing with issues.
Yeah.
Psychological and
relational.
Yeah.
For sure.
So what do you do when you see someone in a toxic relationship, or do you do anything?
I think it's fine it depends on the nature of the relationship you have with that person who is involved in a toxic relationship. Okay. I mean, if you've won the right, and you know this because the relationship is close enough, you've won the right to speak some wisdom into that person's life.
At what point do you step in, or do you let them learn their own lesson? I mean, because as a parent, you don't mandate everything you want to teach your kid. Yeah, they have to learn their own lesson. So at what point do you step in to a friend, a close enough friend that you could talk to about these things? When do you step in? When is it bad enough?
Again, if I'm in a really close relationship, like I can talk to Kevin O'Hara, I can talk to you, and call you out on pretty much anything, because I know that there's a trust relationship there, and that the relationship isn't going to go anywhere, regardless of what I say. So at first acknowledgement of a toxic relationship, you would confront me. I would confront Kevin before I would confront you.
Okay.
So here's why. I feel like there's a different level of vulnerability there with you versus Kevin. Not that I'm closer to Kevin than I am with you, but that I with Kevin, I've learned that he can be in certain areas, just like all of us, really, in certain areas pertaining to relationships, he can be completely oblivious as to what he's doing in the relationship, because of the nature of the relationship and his own
process,
insecurities, or his own process, right? And so and he knows that about himself, and so I know that it's just no issue whatsoever. I can just I can almost do it in a fun, ribbing kind of way, point things out, and that's not going to hurt him or anything. So it just depends on the nature of the relationship that you have with the person.
Is there ever a time where you shouldn't?
Yeah,
or that just
when you haven't won the right, it's just going to depend. But I mean, a general rule of thumb would be: have I really earned the right to speak into this person's life? What is my genuine motivation? That's worth thinking about. Why am I motivated to talk to this person about what I see as a toxic relationship?
Yeah, because there's plenty of those people who they themselves are toxic.
Yes.
So they want to go around and correct everyone.
This is why it's so important, because if you tend to be that person, and you really look at yourself, you're probably going to find that your advice to people about their toxic relationships is more about your shadow being projected onto those relationships, about your own toxicity. It's just, and this is something that the people in your life probably see and don't feel safe to say anything about because, you're not being real with yourself.
But okay, I guess back to the initial part of that question, is there at what point do you let them learn their own lesson? Do you let that happen before or after you talk to them? So like for me, you said you would confront me again after Kevin, but you would still confront me.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you just let me learn my lesson? Or why wouldn't you just let me see it through?
Because it depends on the situation, of course. But if I feel like, and this is just my opinion, and by the way, CYA disclaimer, I'm not a trained licensed psychologist or anything. But I have done a lot of
99.9% of people who give advice are not counselors.
That's right. So. Exactly. So for me, I'm looking for how in touch is my friend with their own contributions to this problem. And if I feel like they're not very in touch at all, I probably won't say anything and just let the consequences teach them. If I feel like they are open to being in touch, but they haven't been in touch, then I think that's worth a discussion.
So it's a different type of like classification of problem, because I'm trying to relate it to like the kid climbing a tree. The parent just lets the kid climb the tree. They'll learn that don't climb up too far. You'll either fall, or if you climb up too far and you can't get back down, that's your problem. You have to learn to climb back down. So it's a different type of thing. Like that, they let them do.
And there's certainly a lot of value there in that example, because they learn to be, strongly independent in a healthy way, but I guess at the same time.
Yeah, I'm very experience based. Now I'm all for learning experiences from others. But so for some people who can't, that's an opportunity that you might take away from them by confronting them.
That's right.
So,
although unlikely, because usually the person that, at least by the criteria that I've laid out for myself, that the person is so out of touch with their own toxicity in the relationship that I'm probably not going to end up taking the opportunity away, because they're probably not going to listen to me.
Okay.
Yeah. But I see it's still a good point though, because what if they do and they do it simply for the sake of their relationship with me or something, and then they don't really learn the lessons that actually reveal the things that need to be revealed about themselves. But
so we established relationships are important. They are necessary basically in this life. And that we've established there are good and bad relationships, and there are good boundaries you can set to even help those bad ones be
maybe even
functional.
Grow to be good.
Yeah, to at least be functional and not harmful to you at least. And so I think later we'll cover how to establish good ones, how to nurture good ones, help to understand what your circle of influence is.
Yes.
So I think that'll be our next one.
Thanks.
Cool.